Welcome, fellow travelers, to your ultimate guide to the USA's top 50 must-see destinations. Our whirlwind tour will take us from the sun-kissed beaches of California to the towering skylines of New York City, and from the majestic peaks of the Rocky Mountains to the vibrant cultures of the Deep South. Prepare to be awestruck by the raw beauty of natural wonders such as the Grand Canyon and Niagara Falls. Get ready to immerse yourself in the electrifying energy of bustling cities like Chicago and New Orleans. Brace yourself for adrenaline-pumping adventures like surfing on the Californian waves and rafting down the Colorado River, and anticipate being captivated by cultural hotspots like the artistic haven of Santa Fe and the historical charm of Philadelphia. Our journey promises to be nothing short of epic, packed with hidden gems, local secrets, and travel hacks to make your American adventure truly unforgettable. So fasten your seatbelts as we embark on this unforgettable journey. Scene script. First, we dive into the heart of Mother Nature's masterpieces. Imagine standing on the precipice of the Grand Canyon, the fiery hues of the setting sun painting the sandstone cliffs in shades of orange and red. The sheer vastness of this colossal chasm is a humbling reminder of the relentless power of nature. Now picture yourself navigating the winding waterways of the Florida Everglades, the air humming with the symphony of wildlife. Each rustle in the brush, each ripple in the water tells a story of an ecosystem teeming with life. We then journey to the mesmerizing Niagara Falls, where the thunderous roar of cascading water echoes through the misty air. It's a spectacle that's both awe-inspiring and invigorating, a testament to the unyielding force and beauty of water. Further afield, the ethereal landscapes of Death Valley envelop you in an otherworldly aura. Here, under the star-studded canvas of the night sky, you encounter solitude in its purest form. Amid the stark silence, you realize that you're not just observing the cosmos, you're a part of it. As we traverse the diverse terrains of America, we find ourselves in the verdant rainforests of Hawaii. As you hike towards the smoldering mouth of the Kilauea volcano, the ground beneath your feet pulsates with the heartbeat of the earth. And finally, we arrive at the surreal spectacle of Yellowstone. It's a place where the earth bubbles, steams, and erupts in a vibrant display of geothermal activity. From the vivid colors of the Grand Prismatic Spring to the powerful burst of Old Faithful Geyser, Yellowstone is nature's playground. Each of these natural wonders offers a unique sensory experience, a chance to immerse yourself in the untamed beauty of our planet. From the echoing canyons to the whispering forests, the crashing waterfalls to the glowing volcanoes, each place sings its own melody in this symphony of nature. These natural wonders, each with its distinct charm, are sure to leave you breathless. From the wilderness, we now step into the pulsating heart of America's most iconic cities. As we embark on our urban jungle adventure, each cityscape unfolds like a novel, each street corner narrating its own unique tale. Let's start with the historical charm of Boston, a city where history and modernity coexist harmoniously. Here, cobblestone streets echo tales of the American Revolution, while modern skyscrapers pierce the skyline, a testament to the city's continuous innovation. The air is filled with the aroma of fresh clam chowder and the lively chatter of locals and tourists alike, creating a symphony of experiences that is quintessentially Boston. From the East Coast, we journey to the heartland. Chicago, the Windy City, greets us with its architectural marvels. The city's skyline, punctuated by towering structures like Willis Tower and Cloud Gate, reflects the spirit of American ingenuity. Here, the deep dish pizza and Chicago-style hot dogs are not just food, but a way of life. As we journey south, we encounter the electrifying energy of New Orleans. Known for its vibrant music scene and unique cuisine, the Big Easy is a city that never sleeps. The sweet melody of jazz fills the air, while the tantalizing smell of gumbo and jambalaya wafts from every corner. On the West Coast, the City of Angels, Los Angeles, awaits with its sun-drenched beaches and iconic Hollywood sign. Here, dreams are made and stars are born. The city's diverse food scene, from food trucks to world-class restaurants, offers a culinary journey as diverse as the city itself. Lastly, we can't forget the city that never sleeps, New York. With its towering skyscrapers, bustling streets, and neon lights, it's a city that's always on the move. From Broadway shows to Central Park strolls, the Big Apple offers endless adventures. These cities, with their vibrant energy and rich culture, promise an experience unlike any other. Now hold on tight as we plunge into the exhilarating world of American adventures. In the land of the free and the home of the brave, adventure is always just around the corner. Whether you're a seasoned thrill-seeker or a novice explorer, the USA has a heart-pounding, adrenaline-pumping experience waiting just for you. Imagine yourself catching a towering wave off the golden coast of California, the rush of the ocean beneath your board, the taste of the salty sea spray, the thrill of conquering nature's raw power. This isn't just any surfing experience, it's California surfing, where the sunsets are as breathtaking as the waves. But perhaps you're more of a river rat, looking to challenge the mighty Colorado River. Picture yourself whitewater rafting, the roar of the rapids in your ears as you navigate the wild waterways. The Colorado River isn't just a river, it's a force of nature, a testament to the untamed beauty of the American West. Or maybe heights are your thing, then why not touch the sky atop Seattle's iconic Space Needle? The view from the top is nothing short of spectacular. The cityscape sprawling beneath you, the distant mountains, the vast expanse of the Pacific Northwest. It's an experience that will make your spirit soar. And let's not forget about the daredevils among us. For you, we suggest a leap of faith in the form of skydiving. Whether it's over the sun-kissed beaches of Florida or the rugged landscapes of Arizona, free-falling from thousands of feet in the air is an experience that will leave you breathless. The thrill of these adventures goes beyond the adrenaline rush. It's about pushing your boundaries, challenging your fears, and embracing the spirit of adventure that is deeply rooted in the American ethos. These thrilling adventures are guaranteed to get your heart racing and your spirit soaring. Finally, we delve into the rich tapestry of American culture. Picture this, you're venturing into the heart of Santa Fe, a city that's a vibrant palette of artistic expression. Santa Fe's artistic soul is as rich as its history, with hundreds of galleries and museums showcasing everything from Native American art to avant-garde installations. The city's annual Indian market, a nearly 100-year-old tradition, is the largest of its kind, drawing artists and enthusiasts from around the world. From Santa Fe, we journey to the birthplace of America, Philadelphia. A city steeped in history, Philadelphia is where the United States founding fathers signed the Declaration of Independence. From the Liberty Bell to Independence Hall, each cobblestone street tells a tale of the nation's past. But Philadelphia isn't just about history. The city's vibrant neighborhoods, like the Italian Market District, are a testament to the rich cultural diversity that defines the American experience. Next stop, the heart of the South, Charleston. Known for its well-preserved architecture, historic plantations, and cobblestone streets, Charleston exudes a charm that's hard to resist. Here, Southern hospitality isn't just a phrase, it's a way of life. Whether you're savoring a dish of shrimp and grits, exploring a centuries-old plantation, or simply chatting with the locals, Charleston's warmth and charm will leave a lasting impression. And that's not all. From the Cajun and Creole flavors of New Orleans to the pulsating rhythms of Miami's Little Havana, the United States is a cultural smorgasbord. Each city, each town, each neighborhood offers a different slice of American life, each with its own unique traditions, stories, and flavors. These cultural gems, steeped in history and tradition, offer a captivating glimpse into America's diverse heritage. And there you have it, 50 of the most incredible destinations the USA has to offer. From the awe-inspiring vistas of the Grand Canyon to the sparkling city lights of the Big Apple, we've journeyed through the vast landscapes of America's natural wonders and immersed ourselves in the vibrant pulse of its bustling cities. Remember the thunderous roar of Niagara Falls, the sun-drenched Californian waves, and the rich history echoing through the streets of Philadelphia? Or how about the artistic soul of Santa Fe, the southern charm of Charleston, and the architectural marvels of Chicago? Each experience a story in itself, waiting to be a part of your personal travelogue. With so much to see and do, it's clear that the USA is a treasure trove of adventures that cater to every traveler's taste. So, what are you waiting for? Now, it's over to you. Comment below with the destination that sparked your wanderlust. And don't forget to subscribe for more amazing travel content. Safe travels and see you on the next adventure.